Hello fellow kin, welcome back to the channel and welcome to another competitive list analysis video. On today's agenda we're going to be taking a look at the Northampton 40k Super Major event held in the UK on the weekend of February 17 to 18, 2024. As always, we'll be taking a look at the Votann placing, looking at some of the matchups and the overall score of the event. We're going to take a deep dive into the list and conduct a little analysis. We'll discuss some of the strengths and weaknesses to the list. And of course, as always, we'll contextualize the results of the placing by looking at some of the matchups. The list in today's video was piloted by James Marston, who took the list 4th out of 105 players at the Northampton 40k Super Major event, making the top cut with 5 wins, 0 draws, and 1 loss. As is with Super Majors, I refer to the top cut as being the new bracket where you are competing for a top position and you are playing extra games. And so as a result of that, we see that James Marston, who was eliminated in the top cut, got to play an extra game against Custodes, who went on to win the event. This takes the total amount of games played up to 6. In terms of matchups, we're looking at the first game of Votann versus Necrons, a 100-point victory to Necrons at 48. This really took me by surprise at a first glance because, in my experience anyway, the Votann versus Necron matchup is actually surprisingly close. So I'm eager to take a look at the list and see what happened here. For Game 2, we have Votann versus Ultramarines, who are running the Vanguard detachment, securing a 93-point victory to the Ultramarines at 43. For Game 3, we have Votann at 100 points versus Tyranids at 58. For Game 4, we have Votann 76 against Necrons at 73. So once again, here we see a Necron matchup, but in this case, the game was much closer. Next up for Game 5, we have Votann at 99 points against Thousand Suns at 54. And lastly, in that top cut bracket, we have a Votann defeat, the only defeat of the event, at 56 points to Custodes at 82. I do wonder if Custodes are back on the menu. Jumping into the analysis, I want you to take a very quick look at what you see on your screen right now, and please do not be fooled, because the devil is in the details here. What appears to be a very normal and standard Votann archetype is actually riddled with little tricks and intricacies, which we'll touch upon in a moment, making for a very surprising and interesting list on the table. Kicking things off, we have 2 support characters being the Ioneer Champion and the Cal, each of which will be leading their appropriate squad of Ioneer Hearthguard. The Cal with Grim Demeanor will be taken on the big brick of Terminators that have plasmas. When we look at the Ioneer Champion, who's leading a 5-man squad of Hearthguard, we see that he's taking Appraising Glare, instead of being the one to carry Grim Demeanor, simply because Grim Demeanor is going to generate you a lot more value on a 10-man Hearthguard brick running plasma guns when you compare that to his Mass Hammer instead. So this is a no-brainer choice. You put this on the Cal because you want the Cal to provide lethal hits to your Hearthguard who have plasma just to enhance the likelihood of damage connecting and going through there. So a pretty standard pick so far. Next up, we have a Grimnir who's taking Wayfarer's Grace. This is a really solid tech piece, something I want to explore and I'm excited to try out in my games next week when I finally get a chance to play with the new data slate. I really like the idea of this guy because he sort of subs in for Hearthkin Warriors. And, I'm a big sucker for Hearthkin Warriors. I love my troop choices in every game, but I do think the Grimnir has a really nice role when he takes Wayfarer's Grace, just for that added level of annoyance and redundancy. He dies, he comes back up, you get a lot more value out of it. It's pivotal, honestly, and maybe helping you hold an objective or primary that you otherwise would have lost if you got shot or if you got killed in combat. So it's very interesting. It's obviously a very good choice. We've seen him make appearances in other lists, but this one does tech him in here, which is quite nice to see. Fighting for a similar role, we have only 1 squad of Hearthkin Warriors here playing the secondary game, and so this guy's running the standard loadout that we see here. It doesn't really matter all that much what you decide to take on these guys. However, I will say that running the high las is probably the most important decision you'll make with the Hearthkin Warriors, simply because it unlocks the potential for you to advance and still do secondaries, because the weapon is Assault. So with the Assault keyword, you still count as being eligible to shoot, which is absolutely pivotal in ensuring you get to do your secondaries if you need to advance, because obviously we're movement speed 5, which is very slow. But having the option to advance just gives you that little extra boost and momentum you might need to reach a table quarter, to reach the center of the board, and just plop these guys down and score as a result of it. So I do think this is a good recommendation to take if you are running Hearthkin Warriors. The high las is probably your most important decision. The other main gun he opted for was the Magna Rail rifle, and this is an okay pick. Like I said, it's a little inconsequential on the Warriors because there's no way of really improving your output, even with the addition of a Judgment token, but I do think you get a little bit more threat with this unit, and you never know, you might chip off a few wounds off a vehicle. Moving along, we have a 5-man squad of Berserks, each equipped with the Mauls, and one obviously taking the free Mold Grenade Launcher because why not? It's free. This has become an actual staple for every list we've reviewed. At least one squad of Berserks is included. It's just such a good trading piece. It's a great unit to include because it's only 100 points, and it basically always trades up as long as you use them correctly and you properly stage. So really solid trading piece, and a pretty staple to include in most lists. Moving along, we have 3 squads of Hearthguard, bringing the total amount of Hearthguard in the list up to 20. This is cool to see because we've actually seen a trend of shifting away from running mass numbers of Hearthguard in lists, and we've even seen some lists forgo the 10-man squad, especially with Plasma, altogether in favor of running 5-mans coming out of land forts. And so what we have here is a nice mix of both. We have 2 5-man squads of Ironeer Hearthguard, and we have a big 10-man brick that's running the Plasma guns. This, on paper, is your bread and butter. You have a unit that is built around the synergies of the lethal hits, optimizing the amount of plasma shots that go through, and then you have your 2 smaller squads of Hearthguard running Vulcanites that are able to benefit from re-rolling for more devastating wounds when they come out of a land fort. It's really, really nice. Now, I mentioned the devil's in the details, and the first one we see is that we only have 2 characters that can lead the Hearthguard squad. So we're actually not taking a character with one of the 5-man units, meaning that this unit is not going to be as durable as we might like to see. This isn't necessarily a bad thing. I'm going to touch upon this when we look at the strengths and weaknesses, but I think this is a very deliberate choice. And in this case, we're bringing that Hearthguard unit as a more elite trading piece instead. Now, in terms of war gear options, for melee weapons, all of the squads are taking the gauntlets. We saw last week one of the lists had taken Plasma Blades, which was a really interesting choice because of the list design. It actually allowed for that unit to play a little bit better into higher infantry target lists. But it looks like in this style here, we've gone for just the reliable, high-punch concussion gauntlets. We looked at this in a lot of detail in the unit analysis video for the Hearthguard, but generally it gives you a lot more play into more targets and allows you to punch a little bit higher, which is really nice because, again, a lot of people run elites and vehicles, and so you don't really necessarily need to rely on infantry killing with this unit, but it might be interesting to see this list played with one squad running the Plasma Blades instead. I can definitely see that work, especially after the video we looked at last week. Additionally, when we look at these 2 smaller units of 5, we have one that's running the Weaver Field and one that's running the Teleport Crest, which means one of them is going to be starting on the table, and the other one has the option of going either into Land Fort or going in Deep Strike. I can't say for certain which squad the Ironeer Champion was attached to, because I actually think there's a compelling argument for either case. You can have the Ironeer Champion along with the Weaver Field Hearthguard unit inside of a land fort, running up the midboard, having some reliable charges out of their vehicle, just having a little bit of an extra punch into anything that might be threatening that center field. Or you can have it run alongside the teleport unit instead, coming down from Deep Strike to threaten the backfield objective, or just force your opponent to screen out a little bit better, providing a more reliable charge once you do land on the table 9 inches away. So I do think we have some interesting choices here, and this lends to the credibility of this list having a very strong, flexible deployment, which is always a plus. I'd be curious to hear how the pilot utilized the Ironeer Champion and which squad he attached it to, if there was always one he went for, or if it depended on the matchup he was facing. I'm not sure if I said this already, but I'll say it again just in case I missed it. Because we're not running a character attached to the Hearthguard unit, this means that the unit as a whole is a lot more durable, but it's also a lot cheaper. So I think that for this reason, we're running that second unit of 5, not as a primary objective focused unit, but instead as a really solid trading piece that has a lot of output, it's elite, and it's threatening. So a really interesting way to utilize the Hearthguard and not something we've ever seen before on the channel. Next up, we have 2 Sagittars. I'm starting to see a trend with Sagittars, except for one list, which I was going to cover last week, but the unit analysis simply took way too much time, so we're going to save that one for another week. But for the most part, we're seeing a trend, a reduction in the number of Sagittars that we're running. This is to be expected because of the points increase. It simply makes the Hecaton look like a much more appealing and attractive choice for list design. Regardless, we have two of them here. Their value is undeniable in that they have some nice scout moves, they have decent shooting, they're a little tanky body, which is good. It's nothing insane, but for 115 points, it's pretty solid. And it allows you to split your warriors up, which is really good because it gives you more secondary play across the board. So we're running two of them here, and we're actually running the missile launchers on both. I am starting to believe that the missile launchers is probably the better choice when you're not running at least 4 of them in your list. Maybe 3 now that the points went up, but I do think missile launchers have a lot of play, particularly in this list when we take a look at what the Hecaton Land Fortress is running, which, spoiler alert, almost made me fall off my seat. The missile launcher is nice because we have a little bit more flexible play with the additional shot that might be turned into anti-infantry versus anti-vehicle, which is nice, and it allows for some really consistent damage to go through at damage 3. This is nice, especially when we only have 2 of them that are shooting, because we don't really want to rely on the variability. Again, tying in with the Hecaton Land Fortress's loadout, which we'll look at in a second. So with the land fort, we're running 2 of them in this list, and this is where things get a little bit crazy. We're actually running 2 Magna Rail cannons on the land forts, 1 on each. This is something that has really taken me by surprise. I spent a lot of time in my other video discussing that, you can do a little bit more damage than I thought you would, but it's just so unreliable that it compromises the amount of damage you're going to be able to dish out. But here we go, in a really top-placing list, with incredible performance, 2 land forts running 2 Magna Rails. An absolute testament to the notion that theoretical is different from practical. And sometimes the theory is there, but in reality, we just get some different results. Okay, so now the big question. Why the inclusion of the Magna Rail? How does this actually work in the list? Now, I can't speak for sure because I haven't had any communication with the pilot of the list, and I haven't seen any of the games, but my guess is that it's an absolute threat overload. You have these 2 giant tanks on the table, each equipped with a devastating weapon that can potentially one-shot most things when you consider both of them shooting at the same target. You have a squad of 10 Iron Hearthguard with plasmas that if you leave them alone, they will do a lot of damage to anything you have, and so just threatening even more elite and high toughness targets. And then you have the 2 smaller skirmishing units of 5 that are running around the board, popping out of their trucks around the board, trying to dish out as much damage as they can, fishing for devs. So I think there's a lot of threat overload in this list. And the reason for that is because you don't have too much secondary play. You have the 2 key units of Pioneers, which we'll look at in a second, and you have the Hearthguard Warriors, but you're going to probably have to leave 1 unit back behind on your home field objective, maybe the Grimnir, maybe not, and then the 2 Warriors, which are in the Sagittars, are going to be going out on the board. So if you lose some of these key units early on, being the Pioneer squad, or the Sagittars containing your Warriors, you might actually lose out on the ability to do some secondary scoring. And because of that, you want to threat saturate your list as much as possible, just so that your opponent simply cannot take the turn to ignore any of these primary threats on the table. You can't ignore the Hecaton Land Fortress with a Magna Rail, even if it's unreliable, because eventually it will connect, and it's a very threatening gun. You also can't ignore a 10-man Iron Hearthguard brick, because it's in your face and it is blowing everything up. There's also added incentive of targeting the land forts because they're potentially carrying Hearthguard cargo, which is going to benefit from devastating wounds, re-rolling. So all in all, you have a really high threat saturated list that's running at you, running towards the center of the board and saying, hey, deal with me. And if you can't, I will table you and everything else will start scoring. I might be completely wrong on that, but what I'm not wrong about is that the Magna Rail also complements the Sagittars missile launcher quite nicely. And why is that? Well, the reason being, we have a lot of variability with this Magna Rail gun. But with the missile launcher, we've baked in, at the very least, even if it's only 3 damage, which is still quite nice, we've built in some reliable and consistent output, which is really good. So the 2 of them interact quite nicely because you can choose to either open up with the Magna Rail cannon and then pick off the 3 wounds that remain, if there are 3 wounds left on the target, because you know if the shot goes through, you'll reliably be able to kill it. Versus if you're running the Hylas on the Sagittars, well, what happens if you do connect a Magna Rail shot and then there's, 2 wounds left on the target and you roll a 1 on the Hylas? It's absolutely pitiful. So because of that, it works really nicely. Having that reliability offsets some of the randomness of the Magma Rail shot, which is quite nice. I want to quickly call out the Hearthkin Warriors again because they are also running one Magna Rail. And while again, it's like really, really unreliable to get this off because your ballistic skill can be benefited beyond a 4 with these guys because for some reason they natively hit on 5 with this gun instead. But just your opponent knowing that you have another Magna Rail hidden in the squad is also pretty impactful, I think, because it allows you just to dish out even more random, high strength, high damage output shots, which might be able to connect and just adds to making that variability a little less random. The land forts are also running twin bolt cannons each. I think the twin bolt cannons is without a doubt the better choice, especially when you're ignoring cover. And we looked at this in detail in the Hekaton Land Fortress unit analysis if you want to take a look at that for a little bit more reasoning behind the decision. But the range is superior, the damage output is superior, and in general you have a lot more play. So I do think this is a staple for the Hekaton Land Fortress at this time. The Magna Rail again took me absolutely by surprise. I'd be really curious to hear how the pilot felt that his Magna Rail performed, because I would imagine when you're playing in the high table, a lot of the armies there have really good invulnerable saves. So what happens if you face an army like that? Maybe like Custodes, for example, right? That's all invulnerable saves. Is the output of your Magna Rail hindered by this? Yes, but to what effect does that translate to on the actual practical side of the table and the game itself? Next up, we have 2 squads of Pioneers. And again, don't glance over these too quickly because we have a different loadout here. We're actually running ion beamers instead of the high-las rotary cannon on both of these Pioneer squads. I had to look up the profile, honestly, because I haven't seen this gun taken before, and it's a little meh, I think. So basically what you get is the ion beamer sustained hits D3 is 18 inches, so it's 6 inches shorter than the high-las. You have half the number of attacks, so going down from 6 to 3. You're also strength 7, up from strength 6 on the high-las, which is nice. And you have an extra point of AP being AP2, and you're still just 1 damage. So there's a little bit of variability here. It's a little bit of a shorter range. You have 1 strength higher at strength 7, 1 extra point of AP, which could be nice. But again, if you're ignoring cover, I'm not too sure how impactful that might be. This is very reminiscent to me of the twin bolt cannon versus the ion on the land fortress situation, except maybe the math is a little bit closer because the high-las is still 1 damage as well, so they're roughly equivalent. I think the difference here primarily is, do you want half the number of shots for a little bit more punch and the option to maybe get sustained hits D3 on the gun? But I am not too sure what I prefer. I feel, in my experience, the Pioneers rarely do any shooting in my games at all, so maybe it doesn't matter all that much. But on paper, I like the idea of having these bikes be able to kill any chaff that might be sitting on a backfield objective when they come out of reserves, or on some table quarter if somebody left a tiny little unit there that is just holding the backfield for scoring some kind of secondary. I could pick it up pretty reliably with the high-las cannon because those units are typically anyway going to be toughness 3 or toughness 4, so it doesn't make too big of a difference going from strength 6 to strength 7, and the extra AP might be helpful here, but I just feel like the weight of fire is probably more impactful. You also still have sustained hits 1 on the high-las rotary cannon instead, but I could be wrong on this. Maybe the pilot could weigh in if he sees this video and mention how he felt the ion beamer performed or why he decided to take the ion beamer instead. I personally don't really see a situation where I feel the ion would be a better choice over the high-las, but I might be missing something here. And again, this list did really well, so clearly it works. So a really cool list overall that takes what many people would consider the ideal standard list of Leagues of Votann with a really subtle twist to most of the key units here and having really good interplay as well. With that said, let's look at some strengths and weaknesses. So on the screen here, I managed to reformat the page a little bit so we have a much clearer view of the visual pie chart breakdown of what I feel most units in this list are going to be performing on the table, what their designated role would be, and that is of course split between primary, secondary, support, and trade. There's nothing too crazy about this. I put the Ironeer Champion and the Cal as support units because they're really here just to enhance the output of the Ironeer Hearthguard. And then for trading pieces, I included the Berserk Squad and then the 1 unit of Hearthguard that are not accompanied by a character because I feel like in this list, that unit plays more of a trading game and its purpose there is to trade rather than score primary for you. When we look at secondaries, I included the 2 Pioneer squads with the Warrior and the Grimnir as well, taking this up to 380 points because these guys are here really just to play secondaries for you. Conversely, for primary, this makes up the large majority of the list, and it includes the 2 Hecaton Land Forts, the 10-man Brick of Hearthguard, the other 5-man Brick of Hearthguard, and the 2 Sagittars as well. Now, in terms of strengths, like I said a few times, there's a lot of threat overload, meaning this is an absolute powerhouse of a list. It does a ton of damage if you leave it on the table and you ignore any of these high threat targets like the Hecatons or the 10-man Brick of Hearthguard. You're really overloading your opponent and making them have to choose between what they kill because you are running it down at them. They simply cannot ignore anything, and if they do choose to ignore it and go for your secondary scorers instead, they are going to be punished on their following turn. So I really think it has excellent primary play, as we can obviously see here in the breakdown of the unit roles, and I think this threat overloads really supports that idea of having such an effective force. I think another really good strength is that there's excellent internal balance. We've really utilized most of the synergies that are available to Votann in this list, just getting the most amount of value out of our index right now, and the units that you've included here, of course. Biggest example being the synergy between having the Sagittars with the missile launchers and the Hecatons that have the more variable high damage shot. Another example of this is the Grimnir, who is also equipped with Wayfarer's Grace, just to provide you with that extra redundancy. When he dies, he comes back. A really good little synergy that you can include. I mentioned this before, but I think flexible deployment is another really good strength to this list. It's very possible that he used the same deployment style every game he played, but I'd like to think that having that option is always really nice, especially because it lets you just better prepare yourself as to what expectations you might need out of certain units and how to better utilize them on the table. Now, I do think there are a few weaknesses with a list like this, and the first one is more of a question, but it looks like there's a few mixed unit roles here. I don't know if this is exactly a weakness. I'd be curious to hear what the pilot thinks, but by this I mean, is it really an effective use of your 160-point Hearthguard unit to use it as a trading piece? And again, this is all predicated on my assumption that it is being used as a trading piece because it's not receiving character support for that extra durability. Another example of this is the Hecaton Land Fortress. This is a little bit of a mixed unit role because I still think you have the potential to be a threat-saturated list even if you're not running the Magna Rail, and you might even get a little bit more reliable damage out of the Cyclic because it allows for more play into units that might have invulnerable saves. So I'm just a little bit curious to hear how he felt these mixed roles and mixed loadouts worked for him in the list, and if there's something he would have liked to change or regrets taking instead. On that note of invulnerable saves, I think this army kind of struggles into invulnerable save armies, maybe like Custodes, for example, simply because the bulk of your high damage in this list is going to stem from your investment in those high AP shots that you're putting out. Think of the plasma guns on the Hearthguard or the Magna Rail on the Hecaton. Just these units alone make up a very large portion of the points in your list, and a large portion of the points in your list dedicated towards being a primary scorer, being a high damage dealer. So I feel because of that the list might struggle into that a little bit. But conversely, when you think about the mixed roles, this might actually be a benefit because of the mixed loadouts that we see, such as the twin bolt cannons, which are going to probably be able to do some nice damage, and also, of course, the 2 5-man squads of Hearthguard that are going to be able to reroll dev wounds. The devs might be really impactful here, especially if they are both coming out of a land fort, just to help fish for more damage that bypasses those invulnerable saves. I put a question mark next to all of these because I'm not sure if there are weaknesses, but they're considerations I have, or rather questions that I would be curious to know the answers to. I think the last one here that is worth considering and asking is that the list is 1970 points. So you're missing about 30 points here. Is there a way that we could have maybe made a slight adjustment somewhere just to get a little bit more value out of the amount of things we're bringing on the table? Or is that 30 points lacking from your list worth it in terms of the internal balance and synergy you've created with the units that were all included in this list? Again, not necessarily a weakness at all. It's just more so a question. In fact, I think I might have to rename the weakness and strength categories to be good considerations and questions, because I'm having a lot of trouble finding some of these weaknesses, and most of them are just questions that usually get clarified by the pilot in the comments below anyway. Let's take a look at the matchups and try to contextualize the list. So game 1 was Votann against Necrons. It was a 100-point victory to Necrons at 48. I mentioned at the beginning of this video that this was really surprising to me because I feel like against Necrons, we're pretty decent, but it's a very even game. Most of my games end very close to being a draw, a WTC draw anyway, and I think that with Necrons, they're extremely durable with a lot of their units having a 4++. They might not necessarily do a lot of damage back, especially if they're not running a lot of Immortal squads, but I still think you have a tough time getting through all those invulnerable saves, particularly if you're running Plasmas, and especially if you're running the Magna Rail Cannon. So for this game, the Necron player was running Canoptic Court, and he was running a pretty standard list, including 2 C'tans, one being a Nightbringer, one being a Void Dragon, and he's also running 1 squad of Immortals only, with 3 Canoptic Doomstalkers and some tech support to help out. He has the Doomstalker that repairs the other ones, he has a few squads of Flayed ones, and he has some Scarabs. So really what this looks like is that all the damage is being baked into these Doomstalkers and the C'tan shards. Everything else is quite negligible, and it's really here to score. So there's a lot of good secondary scoring potential, but most of the damage is baked into, I would say honestly, about 1,000 points or less. So based on the score and based on the 2 lists that we're looking at, I'm inclined to believe this list performs so well because of the fact that the really big primary threats in the Necron list are the 2 C'tan shards here. They opted for a more tech-heavy list with the rest of their units, so they will lack some damage inevitably because of that. Sure, you have the Wraiths who are there to stall and to just be an absolute nuisance to get through, but they don't really punch that hard. The really big threats are the 2 C'tan shards, and because of this, if they do bring these shards to the middle of the table, they actually help us with our biggest weakness in Votann, being that we're so slow. So if he comes to us, we'll be able to respond effectively because we properly staged, and we'll be able to deal with those threats appropriately. In my experience, popping 5 Hearthguard out of a land fort with reroll for your devs, and shooting everything into the C'tan shard and then charging it with your E-Champ who has the Mortal Wounds and Grim Demeter does kill a Nightbringer. Or at the very least comes extremely close to doing so. But keep in mind that this list is running Grim Demeter on the Cal, who's with the Plasma squad. So I think in this situation, it's actually quite nice, because you will get to do a lot of damage, the full 3 damage, if it does go through against the C'tan shard. I also think the list does pretty well into the Wraiths, all things considered. Sure, they're absolutely impossible to kill, but when you consider the sheer weight of fire that this list is packing because of all the Hearthguard units that are included, I actually think you get through them pretty nicely. And so what I assume this game ultimately came down to was a fight over the center, and because this list does really well into killing C'tan shards, we were able to do that, and then as a result, secure the win. There's not much that you need to worry about once you kill these C'tans. Obviously, the Doomstalkers are really scary into Votann because they're quite effective, actually, for their profiles into our defensive stat line. But I think that by popping our Void Armor, by playing effectively into cover, I think we could be okay to survive an onslaught of these attacks. Now, I'm not sure how the Magna Rail plays into Doomstalkers. I feel like it's not that great because the Doomstalker saves on a 4+ and they have 12 wounds. So really for you to actually just one-shot one, you're going to need to do, well, you're going to need the damage to go through, and you're going to actually need to roll 6 on the dice. So I'm not sure if I like these, but I think with 2, you're probably going to be able to whittle one down reliably every turn maybe. I'm not really sure how this plays. I'm not a big fan of the Magna Rail for this reason, because a lot of things have a 4-up invulnerable save, which just essentially bypass the whole reason you're taking this gun. But maybe he didn't even need to shoot into the Doomstalkers for this list to work. Overall, a solid win here, and I think looking at the Necron list helps explain this a bit because it was very tech heavy and simply couldn't keep up with the high threat saturation of this Votann list. Okay, game 2 was a Votann victory of 93 into Ultramarines at 43 for their defeat, and I verified, and the Ultramarine list is running Vanguard Spearhead, so being able to forward deploy. It's a pretty standard list for Ultramarines. We have Marnia's Calgar here with Victus Guard. We have Uriel Ventress with the Apothecary, with the small intercessor squad to score in the backfield. We have a big unit of aggressors who are going to be probably forward deploying with the support of the biologist. We have Centurion Devastators here, which are maybe going to be the recipients to the early deep strike. We have a few Eradicators, and we have some Inceptors sprinkled in with Scouts for more secondary play. Wrapping the list up, we also have the inclusion of a Kaleidos Assassin. So I actually think that the Votann list does exceptionally well into Space Marines because of those 3 wound damage shots we have on the plasma guns. Space Marines also don't really have access to incredible invulnerable saves. Most of the things that you'll be shooting at or they'll be bringing for elites or for tanks are going to probably be at most a 5+ invuln. And so you actually get a lot of value here out of your Magna Rail shot because the chances of you connecting are very high. So I think in this game here particularly, the Votann player was able to get a lot more value out of their Magna Rail than compared to the Necron game. We also play really, really good into Devastator Centurions because if we get to strike first on them, and by strike first I mean if we just get to activate before they do, we can absolutely decimate the squad. This is also particularly useful when we consider the inclusion of Grim Demeanor, which would essentially ignore any tricks that the Ultramarines player would be bringing, such as Armor Contempt, for example, or the -1 to hit from stealth. So not too much to comment on this one. I actually think the Votann list does exceptionally well into this game and matchup. Game 3, we have Votann at 100 points into Tyranids at 58. Now, I don't have a ton of experience with the data sheets for Tyranids or how they play as a whole, but looking at the list, what we have is a nice even spread for Invasion Fleet. We have a few minimum size squads of 10 for Gargoyles, we have some Termagants, we have of course the Biovore, and then we have a bunch of monsters, mostly Exocrines here, and the Maleceptor of course. So I do think, from what limited knowledge I have about this matchup, that Votann would play a little cagier here and try to bait out some of the monsters, and it would be a pretty tense trading game in terms of who reveals what first, because once the Tyranid player does reveal some of his monsters, I do think you have the strength and the firepower to reliably pick one up every turn. I also feel like, just with the nature of Votann, we're very, very strong into some of the smaller sized units, even when they are larger, simply because of our access to blast, our higher strength, and just the mass amount of shots that we get to dish out. I wouldn't feel too threatened by something like this if I was playing Leagues of Votann, simply because I feel confident that the tools I've included in my list would be able to trade very favorably into this. The differential in score between 100 and 58 lends support to this theory. I do think that Votann is generally very good into Tyranids simply because of the way our kits are designed in terms of data sheets and our ability to trade extremely favorably. It looks like the Votann player utilized everything in his list quite effectively and was able to edge out a 100-point victory against the Tyranids at 58. Okay, game 4, Votann 76-point victory into Necrons at 73. Much closer than we saw at the first one, and I think after looking at the lists, I understand why. So this time around, the Necron player was running Hypercrypt Legion Detachment, and I actually think Hypercrypt is really strong into Votann compared to the Canoptic Court one, because you actually get to abuse the slow movement of Votann players by utilizing your extremely, honestly, very good ability of Hypercrypt to teleport around the board. This means there are situations where you might, as a Votann player, try to commit to killing something scary in your opponent's list, like a Catan Shard, for example, and then before you have the chance to actually properly engage to it, once you've committed to that table quarter, well, he just pops up away, he disappears, and he comes down somewhere else instead. I think the movement shenanigans are really, really strong simply because we're so slow, and when we do commit to a spot, we're really hoping that our opponent stays there and fights with us, because that's where we come out on top. In terms of list design, this Necron player was actually leading much heavier into damage output, so focus on primary. We have 2 Catan Shards again, we have a few other characters, we have 2 squads of 10 Immortals, so already significantly more battle line damage as well over here. And then we also have the Wraiths, of course, just to be a nuisance, with a few Locust Destroyers, each running the big cannons. There's a Night Scythe, and to wrap things up, there's a Monolith. So a very durable list, a very annoying list, and one that is very, very fast. Quite scary to play against. I think the tight score here of 76 to 73 speaks to a very, very close game, almost of cat and mouse, where we see both players trading extremely effectively, trying to maintain dominance over the center of the board and kill each other's biggest threats first. Because as soon as one whittles the other one down, the other can just steamroll over the rest. If the Votann player comes out on top and is able to quickly kill some of the Doomstalkers, or even the Monolith in this case, they could be pretty confident in their ability to not need to chase the Necron player around the table. However, if we look at things from the other perspective, the Necron player is probably going to be thinking the same thing. If they're able to kill some of the biggest threats in the Votann list, such as the Hearthguard squads, then they absolutely dominate the game by being able to teleport wherever they need to and without having to have too much of a heavy investment into the center of the table, because you're very durable and you don't necessarily care anymore about the Votann shooting once those biggest threats have been eliminated. So all in all, an extremely close game, one that was probably very fun to play for both players, and congratulations to both of them for such a very close score. Game 5 is Votann at 99 against Thousand Suns at 54. For the Thousand Suns list, the player was running, as you might expect, a lot of characters. Infernal Masters, Sorcerers, Araman, Magnus, a Demon Prince. And we have some very smaller units here of Rubric Marines with Mulith Vortex Beasts to help support some of that primary damage. And we also have the inclusion of some secondary scorers like Zangor and Lightens with some cultists on top of that. So Thousand Suns can be a little scary sometimes when we consider the sheer amount of mortal wounds and devastating wound output that they can actually commit to very quickly and early in the game. I do think that having the Hecaton Land Fortresses here is a big win for Votann and really helps to mitigate the impact of those shots. Why is that? Well, because they take the blunt of the hits. They have to get through 15 wounds on your land fort, and then once they do, then there's still the cargo inside. And the cargo inside is much more valuable than the transport itself. Even though the land fort does a lot of damage and it's a lot of points, the Hearthguard inside pack an absolute punch. And when they get the chance to return fire, it will be absolutely devastating. Again, for the very same reasons we discussed as to why Votann would be capable of killing a Nightbringer very quickly, I actually see the same thing happening, but amplified when we look at Magnus the Red. Magnus is a very strong model on the table. He's very effective. Of course he is. He's 440 points. But I think Votann is actually really good into dealing with him because he's less tanky than a Catan Shard. And once Magnus falls, and with this list, he will probably fall very quickly, despite being able to turn potentially some of the damage of the Magma Rail Rifle into 0, I still think that you have enough threat overloads to just commit to killing him. And once he is dead, it's going to be pretty easy for you to maintain control of the table. Ultimately, Thousand Suns are an army that are strongest at the start of the game, and as you dwindle them down, they get significantly weaker, more so than other armies, because they lose access to their Cabal points. And I think with Votann, and this list in particular, you're very strong in a prolonged matchup because you have so many waves of units you could throw forward. And as a result of that, I think Votann come out on top. For the very last game, the only defeat for the Votann player, which eliminated him from the top cut at 56 to 82 for Custodes, we have the game against Manny Chima, who was running 3 Blade Champions, Trajan Valoris, Custodian Guards, Custodian Wardens, and a smaller squad of Sisters. I can see Custodes being a very big problem for Votann, simply because they are durable enough to withstand some of our shooting. They have the ability to shrug our devastating wounds, and if we want to get in combat with them because we need to finish them off after they withstood our shooting, they can very easily fight first and kill us back. I think in this matchup, the Magna Rail is probably useless. It really isn't that good into things with good invulns, and Custodes have it across the board. And on top of that, there's no single high wound model, so the shots are going to always be wasted. I think for that reason alone, it's probably just not worth running the Magna Rail. I'm really curious to hear how the pilot feels the Magna Rail performed for him at this event, and if he would consider running it again versus maybe something else like the SP Conversion Beamer, which probably would be a lot better into Custodes. Overall, it looks like the Custodian player had a very strong force of smaller elite units who were there to basically just completely dominate the table and dominate primary objective, especially in the center, meaning that the Votann player had a tougher time committing to actually effectively killing some of those units. Even the Plasma Squad, when it comes down and it does do a lot of damage, it's probably hindered simply because of the 4++ that is accessible to the entire army. Overall, it looks like it was a pretty tough game into Custodes using this list. I'm not sure how much that is attributed to the list war gear choices included, or if it's something that's just more fundamental with the faction identity as a whole. All in all, a very solid finish of 5 wins and 1 loss, being top 4 at a 105 player event. So a huge congratulations to James Marston, and of course everyone else who attended the event. For some closing thoughts, I really think this is a cool list design. It's something that I think many of us would probably gravitate to as an initial iteration of a list. Just the very standard and default items that we all know are really good and work very well in a Votann list. But I think the pilot was really creative in utilizing this template as a means for building better intricacies and adding some customization and flavor to the list that makes it stand out as very unique among the rest. What do you guys think about this list? Do you like it? Do you not? Are there some things that you think have merit? Are there some things you'd want to experiment with? I know a lot of people in my Hegaton Land Fortress video said that they love the Magna Rail and they're sad to not see it in any competitive events. Well, looks like we have one here that did extremely well. What do you guys think about that? Let me know down in the comments below. Thank you guys so much for tuning into the video, and as always, for all your kind support. Just a quick heads up, but next week I'm going to be visiting my hometown, so I probably won't have a chance to upload any videos, but I will be playing a lot of 40k with some friends. So I am super excited for that, and maybe when I come back, I'll make a quick video about what my current list design is, what I'm going for, how I feel certain units performed, and what changes I'm probably going to try making before testing it out again. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you all in the next one.